The negotiation room smelled like recycled air and old politics. It was a wide, flat space inside Neutral Station Drevos, built by no one and claimed by everyone, floating between human and Drenhari territory like a coin balanced on its edge. The walls were pale gray. The chairs were uncomfortable on purpose. Nobody was supposed to feel at home here. Rail Dern stood near the left wall with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. He was not a tall man by human standards, but he was built like something that had been compressed under pressure for a long time and never fully released. His uniform was clean. His eyes were not. They moved around the room the way a man's eyes move when he has spent too many years in places where stillness gets you killed. His job today was simple: stand there, look serious, do not speak. He hated this kind of job. Across the room, at a low table near the corner, a woman sat with a data slate in her hands. Her name was Sora Vale. She had been sitting in that same position since before Rail arrived, and she had not moved much since. She was not watching the diplomats. She was not watching the Drenhari delegates on the other side of the long central table. She was reading something on that slate, and whatever it was, it held her full attention in the quiet, total way that a fire holds attention, not dramatic, just complete. Nobody paid her much notice. That was usually how it went with Sora. The Drenhari were tall. That was the first thing humans always noticed about them. They averaged somewhere around 2.5 meters, with four-jointed arms and a forward-leaning posture that made them look like they were always about to say something aggressive. Their skin ranged from deep gray to a dark, bruised violet, and their eyes were flat and amber, with no whites. They wore ceremonial armor to negotiations, which said a great deal about what they thought negotiations were for. There were 6 of them on their side of the table. 3 diplomats, 2 aides, and 1 honor guard soldier who stood behind the lead delegate with the stillness of something carved rather than born. The human side had 4 diplomats, 1 aide, and Rail's squad of 3 as honor guard. The squad was spread along the wall. Turk, Rail's squadmate, stood 2 meters to his left, doing a slightly better job of looking bored without looking dangerous. The talks had been going for 2 hours. Rail had understood about 11 words of it: territory, rights, corridor, sovereignty. The usual geography of people who wanted to own things deciding who owned what. He did not care about any of it. He cared about the tension in the room, which had been climbing slowly the way water climbs in a flooding compartment, steadily, quietly, and then all at once. It happened at hour 2 and 14 minutes. The junior human diplomat, a young man named Das who could not have been more than 26, reached across the table to pass a document to the lead Drenhari delegate. It was a routine gesture, a nothing gesture. The Drenhari honor guard soldier moved, not fast, almost leisurely. He stepped forward, put one four-jointed hand flat against Das's chest and shoved, not hard enough to break anything, hard enough to send Das stumbling backward into his chair, hard enough to make the chair screech against the floor, hard enough to make everyone in the room go completely, absolutely still. It was a deliberate insult. Everyone understood that. The cameras on the walls understood that. The 11 other stations and ships receiving the live feed understood that. The Drenhari honor guard straightened back up and returned to his position as though nothing had occurred, and the lead delegate did not even glance at what had happened. The room held its breath. Sora lowered her data slate. Her thumb, moving without hurry, pressed a single button on the side of it. Rail moved. He did not think about it. There was no gap between seeing and moving, no moment of decision, no internal debate. One instant he was standing against the wall. The next he had covered 3 meters of floor and his right hand had found the collar of the Drenhari honor guard's ceremonial armor, and the entire 2.5-meter alien was going sideways. He did not punch the soldier. He did not need to. He simply redirected 230 kilograms of alien biology into the floor, with the kind of economy that comes from doing something so many times that it no longer requires thought. The impact rattled the table. Then Rail stepped back, straightened, crossed his arms. The room did not hold its breath anymore. The room exploded. The Drenhari diplomats were on their feet. The human diplomats were shouting. Turk had moved to Rail's shoulder without being asked. The honor guard soldier was getting up slowly, amber eyes fixed on Rail with something that was either fury or recalibration, and it was hard to say which was more dangerous. The lead Drenhari delegate pointed at Rail and spoke in his own language, which the translation units rendered as, "This animal attacked a soldier of the Dominion on neutral ground. This is an act of war." The lead human diplomat was already trying to speak. Rail was not listening to any of it. He was watching the Drenhari soldier get up and thinking that if the soldier moved forward, he would need to go again. He was ready. He was always ready. This was the only place in the universe where Rail Dern felt completely at ease. Behind him, at the corner table, Sara Vale picked up her data slate again. On the screen, a quiet notification confirmed what she already knew. The station's external transmission relay had been offline for the last 4 seconds. No recording of the incident had left the room. She had pressed that button before Rail moved, not after. She watched him standing in the middle of the chaos he had created, completely calm in the eye of it, and she did not look surprised. She looked like someone checking a clock and finding the time exactly where she expected it to be. 3 days later, the ceasefire was formally dissolved. The war resumed. In his report to Warlord Vakath, Delegate Nori included a footnote that his superiors almost dismissed entirely. Read, "The male soldier who attacked our guard acted without orders and without hesitation. He is typical of human aggression, predictable in its unpredictability. But there was a woman in the corner of that room who did not react to the incident at all. She was already doing something before it happened. I do not know her name. I do not know her rank. I know only that in 30 years of observing other species, I have never been made to feel watched by someone who was not looking at me. I recommend we find out who she is. I recommend we do this before she finds out something about us." Vakath read the footnote, set the report down, picked it back up. He read the footnote a second time. The moon had no name in any human registry. It was a designation, DVX7 on the charts, a gray rock orbiting a gas giant that nobody wanted for any reason except that it happened to sit between 2 supply routes that everybody wanted very much. It had no atmosphere worth breathing, no water worth drinking, and no scenery worth remembering. What it had was a human outpost dug into its northern ridge, 900 soldiers, and, as of 6 days ago, a Drenhari ground force closing in from 3 directions. Rail Dern was lying flat on the top of a crater wall, looking down at the Drenhari advance through a scope that was starting to fog at the edges because the heating unit inside it was failing. He did not report the failing heating unit. There was no one to report it to who could do anything about it. Below him, across 300 meters of gray rock and scattered black dust, the Drenhari were moving in formation. They moved well. Rail gave them that. They moved the way something moves when it has never considered the possibility of not moving steadily, methodically, with the deep patience of a species that had been conducting warfare since before humanity had invented written language. They had twice the numbers on the ground. Their equipment was better supplied. Their armor was heavier. They had made one mistake. They had not come fast. Rail had used the time they wasted on formation to dig. His squad of 30 had been given a defensive line to hold on the outpost's eastern approach, and what they had done with it in 72 hours of rotation shifts was the kind of thing that military engineers look at afterward and cannot entirely explain. Trenches cut into the crater rock, overlapping fields of fire, 2 dummy positions that looked occupied and 1 real position that looked empty. Turk had rigged a series of noisemakers along the western flank, using equipment that officially had no business being used that way. None of it changed the mathematics. 30 against 300 and growing, with no resupply and no extraction order. Turk crawled up beside Rail and looked through his own scope. "Still coming," Turk said. "Yes," Rail said. "How many do you count on the left approach?" 80, maybe 90. Turk was quiet for a moment. "We have 600 rounds for the long rifles." "I know. That is not 90 rounds per rifle." "I know that too." Turk put his scope down and looked at the side of Rail's face. "You are doing that thing where you are not afraid, and it makes everyone around you afraid instead." Rail almost smiled. "The line does not move. That is the only thing that matters right now. If the line moves, the outpost falls. If the outpost falls, every person inside it dies. So the line does not move." "And if we run out of ammunition?" Rail looked at the ground. There were rocks everywhere. Gray, dense, heavy rocks from a moon that had nothing else to offer. He picked one up. It fit comfortably in his hand. "Then we use those," he said. Turk stared at him. Then Turk lay back down, put his scope back up, and said nothing more, because there was nothing to say to a man who had already done his thinking and come out the other side into a place that was beyond fear. The first engagement began 40 minutes later. It went badly and it went well simultaneously, which is the truest description of every firefight ever fought. The Drenhari pushed hard on the left approach. Rail's squad gave ground on purpose, pulling them into the kill zone, and then the overlapping fire worked exactly as planned and the advance stalled. 40 Drenhari soldiers fell back. The line held. But it cost 1,200 rounds to do it. The Drenhari pulled back and reorganized. Then they pushed again, different angle. The line held again, and this time it cost 800 rounds. There were now fewer than 2,000 left for 30 rifles, and the Drenhari were already forming up for a third push. Rail sent one message to command. It was 6 words: "Need ammunition, not extraction," 6 words. He got back an automated acknowledgement and nothing else. On the human carrier Resolute Hand, 17,000 kilometers above the moon's surface, Sara Vale had been awake for 31 hours. She was not watching the ground battle. She had looked at the ground battle once, confirmed that Rail's squad was doing the only thing that could be done with what they had, and then turned her attention to the thing nobody else was looking at, which was the space above the moon. The Drenhari fleet had positioned itself in a textbook formation. That was the thing that had caught her attention first. Not because textbook formations were wrong, they were often correct, but because the word textbook implied a book, and books implied authors, and the Drenhari were an ancient species with very specific ideas about how space warfare should be conducted, ideas that traced back, she had discovered, to a single strategic text written by an admiral named Vorath, done approximately 400 years ago. She had read the complete works of Vorath done in one night, all 9 volumes. The translation was rough and the tactical language was often archaic, but the underlying logic was clear and it was elegant, and it had one specific property that Sora found extremely interesting. It was entirely rigid. Every positioning decision Vokath's fleet had made in the last 3 weeks was in those 9 volumes. Every supply corridor, every flanking preference, every timed rotation interval. 400 years of military dominance built on a foundation that nobody had ever seriously questioned, because nobody had ever needed to, because the Drenhari Dominion was very old and very powerful and very few species had ever sat down and actually read Vorath Dunn's 9 volumes in a single night and thought carefully about what was missing from them. What was missing was a contingency for someone who had also read them. Sara looked at the fleet positioning data for a long time. Then she looked at the communications architecture the Drenhari used. Then she looked at something that appeared in Volume 6 of Vorath Dunn's works almost as a footnote, a section on fleet authentication signals, written at a time when encryption was simpler, never updated because the Dominion's internal security doctrine assumed that the cipher was unknown to outsiders. She opened a new document. She wrote 3 sentences. She forwarded it to Admiral Gren with the subject line, "Authorization Request Priority." Gren read it. He read it a second time with his head tilted slightly, the way a person tilts their head when they are looking at something that does not match any category they have. Then he went pale in a specific way, not the pale of fear, but the pale of sudden cold understanding. He approved it in under a minute. On the moon, rail was down to 400 rounds, and a significant number of rocks when every Drenhari ship above him went dark at exactly the same moment. He looked up, force of habit. You cannot see ships from the surface of an airless moon with the naked eye. He looked up anyway. The Drenhari ground forces stopped advancing. The communication blackout from their fleet was reaching their surface units now. Confusion was spreading through their formations the way confusion spreads through any military structure when the top goes silent, first disbelief, then query, then the terrible waiting. Then the withdrawal order came, fleet-wide, priority alpha, in perfect Drenhari authentication code, signed with Vakath's own cipher. The ground forces pulled back. They pulled back all the way. Rail stood up slowly from behind his position. Turk came up beside him. They watched the Drenhari formations dissolve into the gray distance. Nobody fired. Nobody advanced. The moon was completely quiet except for the sound of 2 men breathing recycled air through helmets that had seen better decades. "What just happened?" Turk said. Rail looked up at the sky again. He stood there for a moment with 400 rounds and a rock still in his hand. "I think someone did something," he said. "Someone on our side." Rail thought about the woman in the corner of a negotiation room, lowering a data slate with exactly the same expression a person has when they check a prediction and find it correct. "Yeah," he said, "someone on our side." There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a military command room when something happens that nobody has words for yet. It is not the silence of calm. It is not the silence of confusion. It is the silence of people who are very smart, very experienced, and very suddenly aware that the world has just done something that their experience did not prepare them for. The command room of the Resolute Hand had been in that silence for about 4 minutes when Admiral Gren finally said, quietly, to nobody in particular, "She did not fire a single weapon." Nobody responded. There was nothing to add. What Sora had done was this. She had studied 6 months of Drenhari fleet positioning data and found something buried inside the standard telemetry packets their ships broadcast continuously. A rhythmic subsignal, present in every transmission, that bore a structure too deliberate to be noise and too consistent to be coincidence. She had then spent the better part of one night cross-referencing that signal structure against the cipher system, described almost casually in the 6th volume of Voreth Dunn's 400-year-old strategic text, written at a time when the Drenhari Dominion had no rivals worth encrypting against. The signal was their fleet authentication system, the same one, unchanged. For 80 years, the Drenhari had been broadcasting their command cipher inside every routine transmission because the cipher was old enough that no living Drenhari officer thought of it as something that needed to be protected anymore. It had become invisible through familiarity, the way a lock on a door becomes invisible to the people who live in the house. Her 3-sentence memo to Gren had explained what the signal was, confirmed she had isolated the authentication key, and requested authorization to transmit a single fleet-wide command using Warlord Vakath's personal cipher prefix, which was included in every transmission his command ship sent, and was, therefore, also known to her. The command she sent was 8 words in Drenhari military notation. All UNITS, ordered withdrawal, priority alpha, Dominion's will. 600 warships received it. 600 warships began their withdrawal protocols. The entire Drenhari military presence above DVX-7 evaporated in under 40 minutes, and the ground forces, cut off from fleet coordination, and receiving a priority withdrawal order they could not authenticate against, because the order itself was the authentication, followed. No human ship had moved, no human weapon had fired, no human soldier had advanced. Sora had won a fleet engagement with a text document. Admiral Grun sat with that fact for a long time. Then he called her to his office, which was not a comfortable office and was not meant to be, and he stood behind his desk because he did not feel like sitting, and he said, "You did this without informing me of the method." Sora stood across the desk from him. She was not particularly tall and she was not particularly imposing, and she had the kind of face that rooms forgot about until she spoke, which was perhaps why rooms kept being surprised by her. "The method required authorization, not description," she said. "If I had described it first, you would have spent time evaluating whether it was possible. It was faster to show you the conclusion and let you decide on trust. That is not standard protocol." "No," she agreed. Grun looked at her for a moment. "It worked." "Yes." 900 people on that moon are alive." "Yes." He was quiet. "Then, the Drunhari will know what happened. They will know within hours if they don't already. Their warlord will pull the authentication system apart and find where the leak was, and he will understand exactly what you did." "Yes," Sora said again. "Does that concern you?" She thought about it genuinely, which was something Grun had learned to recognize. The brief stillness before she spoke that meant she was not reaching for a polished answer, but actually running the question through something. "What concerns me," she said, "is what Vuketh does once he understands. A leader who responds to that with anger becomes more aggressive and less careful. A leader who responds with analysis becomes more dangerous. Vuketh is the second kind." Grun sat down. "After all, what do we do about that?" "I'm working on it," she said, which Grun was learning was the most alarming thing Sora Vul could say. Aboard the Drunhari command ship Dominion's Patience, Warlord Vuketh was not angry. His senior officers had been watching him for the past 3 hours with the careful sideways attention of people standing near something that might or might not be about to explode. They had seen Vuketh angry before. Anger had a familiar shape. This was not that shape. He had reviewed the transmission logs twice. He had called in his cipher specialists, listened to them explain, in increasingly uncomfortable terms, that the authentication breach had not come from inside their own systems, that the signal had originated from a human vessel, and had been constructed with such precision that every Fulsuf in their fleet had accepted it without question. He had listened to all of that with his hands flat on the surface of his command table, and his eyes focused on the middle distance. Then he had dismissed everyone except Delegate Nari, who was still aboard under a courtesy arrangement that had predated the current unpleasantness and had not yet been formally revoked. "You mentioned a woman," Vuketh said. Nari, who had been standing very still near the wall in the way that beings stand still when they want to be overlooked, straightened slightly. "In my report from the station, yes, during the ceasefire talks." "Tell me again, not from the report. Tell me what you saw." Nari considered. She was sitting in a corner. She had a data slate. She was not watching the room in any active way, not the way a security officer watches a room, not the way a diplomat watches a room. She was reading something. When the incident happened, when the human soldier attacked our guard, she did not react to it. She was the only person in the room who did not react to it. He paused. She was doing something before it happened, something small. I do not know what it was. Vuketh looked at him. She cut the transmission relay. Nari went still in a different way. She anticipated that the soldier would. She did not anticipate. Anticipation implies uncertainty. She knew. Vuketh turned back to his command table. The soldier acts. She enables and controls the environment in which the action occurs. They are not separate assets, they are a system. He was quiet for a moment. We have been fighting the wrong threat. Nari said carefully, "What do you intend to do?" Vuketh looked at the withdrawal coordinates still displayed on his tactical board. 600 ships, pulled back by 8 words from a human who had read a book that Vuketh himself had never read because it was 400 years old, and everyone already knew what was in it. "Find her name," he said. "Find her rank. Find where she sleeps on that carrier." He paused. "We are going to remove the thinking part of their weapon. The charging part is manageable without it." What Vuketh did not know, as he said this, was that Sora Vol had been expecting this decision for the past 2 hours. She had already prepared for it. She had not told anyone she was preparing for it, because telling people you are preparing for an assassination attempt on yourself requires a level of explanation that tends to slow things down. She had simply made adjustments, quietly, the way she did everything. Back on DVX-7, Roll Dern was sitting on the crater wall in a suit that needed maintenance and holding a grey rock from a moon with no name, and he was thinking about the fact that he was alive when, by every measure of logic and ammunition count, he should not be. He had done his part. He had held the line, but something had happened above him that had nothing to do with holding lines. He turned the rock over in his gloved hand. He was going to find out who did that, and he was going to say something to them, though he had not yet figured out what. Thank you seemed too small. Whatever it was, he would think of it when he got there. He always figured things out eventually. He was just slower about it than some people. The supply freighter Drunhari Auxiliary Vessel 9 had docked with the Resolute Hand at 1100 hours under a standard resupply authorization that had been filed 4 days prior, approved by 2 separate logistics officers, and cross-checked by the carrier's security AI against a list of pre-cleared vessels. Everything about it was correct. The authorization codes were valid. The cargo manifests matched. The vessel's identification transponder matched the registry. The crew of 6 carried biometric profiles that corresponded exactly to 6 Drunhari civilian contractors, who had been operating resupply routes in this sector for the past 2 years. All of it was real. That was the uncomfortable part. The Drunhari Infiltration Unit had not faked a ship or stolen identities. They had, over the past 8 months, slowly and methodically built 6 real identities inside the actual resupply network, patient in the way that only a species that has been conducting intelligence operations for centuries can be patient. They had done this before the war resumed, before the ceasefire collapsed, before the incident at the station. They had done it because Vuketh believed in building doors before you needed them. The unit's leader was called Druv. He was not particularly large for a Drunhari, which still made him larger than most humans in the room, and he had the specific kind of stillness that comes from years of training the body to broadcast nothing. His team moved through the carrier's cargo bay with the unhurried competence of people who had memorized the layout weeks ago, because they had. They split into pairs at the first junction, 2 to the secondary access corridor, 2 to establish a holding position. Druv and his second, a female specialist named Arn, moved toward the crew quarters level. They had a name now, Sora Vol. They had her rank Tactical Analyst, which was a title so deliberately unimpressive that Druv had spent some time thinking about who chooses that title for themselves. They had her quarters assignment, Deck 7, Room 14. They had a shift schedule that showed she worked irregular hours and often returned to her quarters between 300 and 500. They had all of this from a source inside human logistics, who had been compromised 6 weeks ago over a debt and a promise. The carrier was large. They moved through it without being stopped, because they looked like what their papers said they were, and because humans, Druv had observed over 2 years of operating among them, extended a particular kind of trust to paperwork that the Drunhari found both useful and faintly baffling. The Drunhari verified identity through biological confirmation and social hierarchy. Humans had invented bureaucracy and then, somehow, decided to trust it. It had made his job much easier. At 4:12 hours, Drev and On reached Deck 7. The corridor was empty. The lighting was set to night cycle dim. Room 14 had a standard human door lock, which On bypassed in 12 seconds with a tool that fit in her palm. The door slid open. Drev stepped inside. The room was empty. The bunk was cold, not recently vacated cold, but hours ago cold. A jacket hung on the back of a chair. A pair of boots sat neatly beside the bunk. On the small desk, a data slate sat face up, unlocked, its screen still active. Drev crossed to the desk. On the screen was a single document. He read it. He read it a second time, more slowly. The document contained the insertion route his team had taken through the cargo bay. It contained the junction split decision. It contained the quarters assignment they had targeted. It contained the name of the compromised logistics source. It contained the biometric profiles of all 6 of his team members. It contained the name of the debt the source had been compromised over. At the bottom, below all of this, was a single line of text. It read, "Security teams are behind you. Please do not make them run." Drev stood very still for a moment. Owen was in the doorway. He turned and looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression of someone who has just understood something they would rather not have understood. He turned around. The corridor behind On was no longer empty. It was full of human soldiers in full gear, arranged in a tactical stack with the kind of practiced calm that meant they had been waiting here for some time, and were not in any particular hurry, because the outcome was not in any meaningful doubt. Leading them, standing slightly to the side of the formation with his arms crossed, was a human man who was not particularly tall, but had the build of something that had never once in its life agreed to be stopped by anything. Rael Dern looked at Drev. Then he looked at the data slate in Drev's hand. Then he looked back at Drev. "She figured you out before you docked," Rael said. "I figured out where to stand. We make a good team." The surrender took about 40 seconds. The Drenhari unit was professional enough to know when a position was unrecoverable, and this position had been unrecoverable before they left their ship. Drev set down the tool On was holding and straightened, and the human soldiers moved in with the efficient, impersonal motion of people who had done this before and preferred it clean. As he was being processed, Drev said to the soldier nearest to him, a compact, wry-looking man who moved with the ease of someone in his preferred environment, "Where is she?" The soldier, Turk, looked at him with mild interest. "Who?" "The woman, the one who wrote the document." Turk thought about it. "Honestly, no idea. She moves around a lot. I don't think she sleeps in the same place 2 nights in a row, but I've never asked her about it because she would tell me exactly why, and it would take about 45 minutes, and I would understand all of it and feel slightly worse about my own intelligence for the rest of the day." Drev processed that. He looked at the data slate he had set down, which a human soldier had bagged as evidence. A document that had been waiting for him on a desk in an empty room. A woman who was not there, who had not been there for hours, who had known he was coming and had chosen to not be present, not because she was afraid of him, but because the interaction was already over before it began, and her presence was not required for the conclusion. He thought about what that meant, about the kind of mind that would look at an assassination operation and see it not as a threat to be defended against, but as a problem to be solved, and then solve it from the inside out, and then leave a polite note. He thought about Warlord Vakath's instructions: find the thinking part of their weapon, remove it. The thinking part had known they were coming for 2 weeks, had let them come, had arranged the room and the document and the soldiers in the corridor and left, was somewhere else on the carrier right now, or possibly not on the carrier at all, working on the next thing. You could not remove something like that. You could only hope it decided not to remove you. In her new location, a small, unused equipment room on Deck 3, that she had identified 3 days ago as the kind of place nobody ever checked. Sora sat with her data slate and a cup of something that had once been tea before the heating unit in the galley started having the same problems as everything else on a carrier that was long past its service interval. She was not thinking about the infiltration unit. That was finished. She was thinking about what Vakath would do next. She had given him 3 possible responses to this failure: escalate, negotiate, or replace her as a priority target with something that could not be captured. She had assigned rough probabilities to each and had begun preliminary work on responses to all 3. The escalation response was nearly complete. The replacement target response she had handed to Gren's security team this morning, with a quiet recommendation to increase the Admiral's personal protection without making it obvious. The negotiation response she had not given to anyone yet. That one she was keeping close, because it depended on something she was still not certain about: whether Vakath was the kind of leader who could change his mind when presented with the right argument, or only when presented with no remaining alternative. She was fairly sure she knew the answer. She was not certain. She disliked not being certain. She worked until she was, then she would send the message. Outside the equipment room, somewhere forward on the carrier, she could hear the distant procedural sounds of a security processing event. Measured, contained, exactly as planned. She picked up the tea. It was cold. She drank it anyway. The message reached Vakath's personal command terminal at 600 hours, carrier time. It was unencrypted. It had not passed through any military relay. It had arrived in his direct channel the way a stone arrives in a still pond, without announcement, producing only consequence. The sender address was a human designation he did not recognize. The body of the message was 4 words, a name, and a dash. It said, "Warlord Vakath, I suggest we talk, SV." His communications officer had flagged it immediately. His security chief had traced it immediately. Both of them had come to him with the same expression, the expression of people holding something they did not know how to categorize. The trace had confirmed the message originated from inside the human carrier resolute hand. It had also confirmed that the routing was clean, no malware, no embedded signal, no trap attached to it. It was exactly what it appeared to be: an invitation. Vakath sat in his command chair for a long time after they left. The ambient sound of the Dominion's patience moved around him the way it always did, the low hum of a vessel that was very large and very old and had seen things. He had commanded from this chair for 19 years. He had seen 7 species yield to Drenhari pressure in this chair. He had signed the orders that ended 4 wars, all of them in the Dominion's favor. He opened a secure response channel and typed 6 words back: "I will speak with you, now." The channel opened. There was a moment of carrier noise, the small static hiss of a live connection crossing 17,000 kilometers of space. Then her voice came through, measured, clear, unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who is not performing calm but simply is it. "Thank you for responding," she said. "You did not expect me not to," Vakath replied. His translator rendered his Drenhari into the flat, clean human standard that diplomatic channels used. He disliked it. It made him sound less like himself. "No," she agreed. "You are a strategic thinker. An open channel with an enemy intelligence asset is information. You would always take it." He let that settle without comment. "You are very direct for a human who is technically committing an unauthorized act of contact." "I am always direct when directness is faster," she said. "And yes, my admiral does not know I am doing this." "That interests me. You operate outside your chain of command." "I operate at the edge of it," she said, "when the chain is slower than the problem. Admiral Gren is a good officer. He is also working on a 3-day decision cycle. I am working on an 11-hour one. The two are not always compatible." Vakath's amber eyes moved across the tactical display in front of him, the one showing the current positions of both fleets. "My unit," he said. "The one aboard your carrier." is in custody, unharmed. They performed their mission correctly. The mission itself was the problem. It was based on an incorrect model of what I am. Explain. You assumed I was an asset to be removed, a node in a system. Remove the node, degrade the system. She paused. I am not a node. I am a method. The method is distributed across documentation, trained personnel, and institutional adjustments I have already made to your fleet's ability to read us. Removing me would slow the method. It would not stop it. Vaketh was quiet for a moment. He appreciated precision in an opponent. He found it clarifying. You are telling me that my strategy was wrong. I am telling you that your strategy was based on a model of human military intelligence that is approximately 40 years out of date. She said it without emphasis, the way someone states a measurement. The Drenhari Dominion's doctrine was written for a humanity that fought with instinct and mass. You are very good at countering instinct and mass. What you are less prepared for is a human military structure that has learned to do both simultaneously. That can put a man in a crater with rocks and no ammunition, and also make 600 of your warships leave without firing a shot. Another silence, longer this time. Vaketh did not speak into silences just to fill them. That was one of the things that made him dangerous. Go on, he said. I can tell you exactly how we defeat you, she said. Over the next 6 months, in detail. I can give you the strategic sequence, the expected fleet movements, the ground operations, the projected outcome at each stage. I can do that now on this call, and you can spend the next 6 months verifying every projection as it unfolds and confirming that I am accurate. The temperature of the conversation changed. It did not get louder. It got denser. That would be a remarkable intelligence gift to offer an enemy, Vaketh said carefully. I am not offering it as a gift, Sora said. I am offering it as evidence. You are a leader who responds to data. I have data. The data says this war ends in the same place regardless of how many more months we spend arriving there. The only variable is how many people die during those months. You are trying to end the war. I am trying to end it before I have to execute the plan I just described. She stopped. Then, in exactly the same tone, I am not bluffing, warlord. He knew she was not bluffing. That was the thing. In 19 years in that chair, he had heard a great deal of bluffing, and it had a texture, a slight excess of certainty that covered a hollow center. What he was hearing had no hollow center. It had the density of a thing that had already been built. What do you want in return? He asked. Nothing that is not already in your interest, she said. A cessation of hostilities on terms that the Drenhari High Council can accept without loss of face, territorial arrangements that recognize current positions, and a formal acknowledgement that humans are not a nuisance species. Vaketh's jaw set slightly. The last item, that is political. Everything is political, she said, but it is also accurate, and you know it is accurate, warlord. You have known it since the withdrawal signal, possibly since the station when you read Nori's report. He said nothing. You are old enough to have seen what happens to empires that refuse to update their understanding of the galaxy, she said. I am not threatening you. I am offering you the version of this that does not require either of us to be right about who wins. I already know who wins. I am asking you to save the cost of finding out. Vaketh looked at the tactical display for a long time. The positions of 2 fleets, drawn in light across the dark. 17,000 kilometers of nothing between them. He thought about Voreth Dun, 400 years ago, writing 9 volumes of doctrine that had served the Dominion so well and so long that it had become invisible. He thought about a human woman reading those 9 volumes in a single night and finding the door inside them. He thought about what it meant that she had called him directly, not to threaten, not to negotiate, to talk, to treat him as someone worth talking to. That was its own kind of data. I will consult the High Council, he said. I know, she said. I gave you 11 hours in my planning. The channel closed. Vaketh sat in his chair for a while after that. Meanwhile, outside a small equipment room on Deck 3 of the Resolute Hand, Rael Dern had found the door. He did not know it was an equipment room. He had tracked her through the carrier the way he tracked things through all environments, by paying attention to where everything was empty and then finding the one small place that was not quite empty enough. He knocked on the door. A short pause. Then it opened. Sara looked at him without surprise. She was holding a data slate. The room behind her had a single light source and smelled like old circuitry and cold tea. "You were on the channel," Rael said. "It was not a question." "Yes." "With Vaketh." "Yes." He leaned against the door frame. He was quiet for a moment, which did not come naturally to him, but which he was trying because this seemed like a moment that deserved it. "If he locks on the signal." "I routed it through 4 carrier relays and a civilian buoy. By the time any trace resolves, the conversation will have been over for 6 hours." He was quiet again. "You could have told someone what you were doing." "It was faster alone." "That is not the same as it being safer alone." She looked at him. He looked back. He was not angry exactly. He was something more specific than angry. He was the particular form of uneasy that a person feels when someone they have started to care about treats their own life as a variable in a calculation. "I will stand outside this door," he said. "If you are going to do things that could get you killed, someone should be in the corridor." "That would not actually help," she said. "I know that," he said. "I am going to do it anyway." She looked at him for a long time, not calculating, just looking. 11 hours, she said finally. "Vaketh needs 11 hours to reach his council and begin the process, if he responds differently than I expect." "Then we deal with it," Rael said. She nodded, very slightly, and stepped back from the door. She did not tell him to leave. He moved to the corridor wall and put his back to it and crossed his arms and settled in, and the equipment room door stayed open just enough that the light from inside fell in a narrow line across the floor. Neither of them spoke. The carrier moved through the dark around them. 17,000 kilometers away, an old warlord was preparing to speak to a council about what it meant to lose a war that had not technically been lost yet, to a species that had, until very recently, been considered a manageable problem. 11 hours. Sora had given it 11 hours. It took 10 hours and 53 minutes. The formal cessation of hostilities was signed aboard neutral station Drevos, the same station where the ceasefire had collapsed, which was either poetic or convenient depending on who you asked. The signing took 4 hours. There were photographs. There were speeches. Admiral Gren stood at the center of the human delegation, with the expression of a man who understood that he was the visible face of something he had not entirely understood in the moment it happened. The Drenhari delegation was led by a senior council member who was not Vaketh, because Vaketh did not attend the signing, and nobody in either delegation thought it appropriate to ask why. Delegate Nari was present. He stood at the edge of the Drenhari side with his hands folded in front of him, and watched the human delegation with the particular attention of someone who knows more than they are expected to know. When the signing was complete and the room began to move in the way rooms move when something large and formal is winding down, Nari moved to the edge of the space and stood there, and after a while Rael Dern ended up standing nearby, the way things that are heavy tend to end up near the floor. Nari looked at him. "You were the soldier," he said, "from the first meeting." Rael nodded. "You hit our guard." "He pushed a kid," Rael said, simply, without apology. Nari was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where is she, the woman from the corner?" Rael looked around the room. Then he said, "She does not come to ceremonies." Which was true. Sara had been invited. She had sent a brief message to Gren's aide explaining that she was in the middle of something and would review the ceremony recording later if it was relevant. The aide had not known what to do with that information, and had ultimately filed it under Administrative Anomalies, which was the folder where SAR-related communications went when they did not fit anywhere else. What she was in the middle of was a classified addendum to the strategic record of the conflict. It was not required. Nobody had asked for it. She was writing it because she believed that accurate records were more important than comfortable ones, and because the alternative was to let the official history describe this war as a triumph of human military force, and she could not make herself do that. The addendum was precise and it was honest, and it was one of the hardest things she had written. It laid out in clear and documented terms every casualty of the conflict on both sides. It laid out the points at which different decisions could have changed the count. It named the incident at the station, the shove, the response, the collapsed ceasefire as the turning point that had made everything else necessary. It assigned no blame to the soldier who had moved. It assigned the weight of 11 deaths, the 11 soldiers lost in the first 3 weeks of resumed conflict before the withdrawal, to the gap between what she had seen coming and what she had been positioned to prevent. She had seen it coming. She had been in that room. She had known the Drenhari Guard was going to provoke. She had read the behavioral pattern across 6 months of contact reports and had identified 3 specific individuals in the Drenhari delegation whose manner and history suggested a high probability of deliberate provocation. She had known. She had also known that a provocation caught and neutralized in the moment, with cameras recording, would give the Drenhari the political position of a grievance denied. She had made a calculation. She had cut the cameras and let the moment happen, because a provocation without a recording was a provocation without a lever. She had chosen the strategic position over the immediate prevention, and 11 people who might otherwise have lived had died in the weeks that followed. She sat with that for a long time, not to punish herself, because it was true and she did not believe in looking away from true things. The 11 names were in the addendum. She had found all of them. She had read what she could find about each of them because they deserved at minimum to be known. When she was done, she filed the addendum under the appropriate classification level and closed her data slate. Then she sat in the small room that was not her quarters. She had moved to a proper bunk 2 days ago now that the operational need for dispersal was gone, but she had kept the equipment room out of something that was not quite sentiment. And she was still there when the door opened and Rail came in without knocking, which was something she had decided to allow, because asking him to knock first was a conversation she did not have the energy for. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall, which was how Rail Dern sat when he was thinking rather than acting, because sitting in a chair felt too settled. He looked at her. She looked back. "You read it," she said. It was not a question. He had clearance for very little of what she produced. He had apparently found a way around that. "I have a friend in records," Rail said. He did not sound apologetic. He sounded like a man who has done something he intended to do and is prepared to account for it. "You saved 900 people on that moon." "I know. Those 11, that was not your fault." She looked at him with something that was not agreement and not disagreement. It was the look of someone who has had a conversation with themselves about this already and has arrived at a position that they are going to hold because it is honest, not because it is comfortable. "I made a decision that I believed was strategically correct," she said. "I still believe it was strategically correct. I also know that 11 people died in a war that resumed partly because of a moment I could have interrupted. Both of those things are true at the same time." Rail was quiet. "Then, how do you carry that?" She thought about it, not the quick answer version, the real version. "The same way you charge into things you know will hurt you," she said, "because the alternative is worse." He thought about that for a moment. "Worse how?" "If I had stopped calculating," she said, "if I had decided the weight of it was too much and simplified my methods and stopped looking ahead, more people would have died. The calculation costs me. Not calculating costs everyone else." She paused. "You know this. You know it in a different form." He did know. He knew it the way a man knows something he has never said out loud, that the reason he charges without hesitation is not because he does not feel fear but because he made a choice, long ago, to put himself between his fear and the people behind him. That choice has a cost. He pays it every time. He has never complained about it because complaining would require explaining it, and explaining it would require a kind of stillness he was not built for. They sat in silence for a while, not comfortable, not uncomfortable, just two people in a small room being honest about what things cost, which is the rarest form of honesty there is. Aboard the Drenhari High Council ship, Delegate Nori submitted his final observational report on the conflict. He had been writing it in pieces for weeks, adding to it as events developed, and the final version was considerably longer than his normal reports. The section on human military capability was the longest. His superiors had been expecting something clinical. What they received was something more like testimony. He described Rael Dern in clear terms: the speed, the decisiveness, the physical ferocity, the complete absence of hesitation, and noted that against Drenhari doctrine, this type of fighter was manageable, fast but readable, predictable in its unpredictability as he had written once before. Then he described Soravale. He described the corner of the negotiation room and the data slate and the button pressed before the charge. He described the 3 sentences that moved 600 warships. He described the empty room and the document on the desk and the polite note at the bottom. He described the voice on the channel. Vakath had told the council what was said, because Vakath was the kind of leader who believed the council deserved the truth even when it was uncomfortable. And he described what it meant that a human had called a Drenhari warlord and spoken to him as an equal, and offered him a way out that cost neither of them their dignity. At the end, he wrote, the male hits things before he thinks. The female thinks of things before they happen. They are not 2 different kinds of human. They are 2 halves of the same weapon, and they know it. I do not know if they understand fully what they are together. I think she does. I think he is beginning to. The galaxy does not yet have a word for what that combination becomes when it has time to develop. I recommend we not give it that time. I also recommend, with equal sincerity, that it is probably already too late. The High Council read the report. They read the relevant sections twice. Then they sat in the silence that large groups of old and experienced beings sit in when they have encountered something that their experience did not predict, and they stayed in that silence for quite a while. There was no more war to resume. The cessation was signed. The territorial arrangements were in place. The formal acknowledgement of humanity's status, that one had required 3 separate drafts and had caused a minor constitutional crisis in the council chambers, but it was in the document, was filed and registered. The Drenhari dominion was ancient. It was patient. It was proud. And it had, in the space of a few months, been outmaneuvered by 2 humans who operated on opposite ends of the same principle. When there is something that needs to be done, you do it now with everything you have, without waiting to see if conditions improve, because conditions do not improve on their own. Conditions are what you make them. One of them made conditions with his hands and his body, and the absolute refusal to accept that a line could be moved. The other made conditions with her mind, quietly in the dark, in empty rooms, in the spaces between what was happening and what was about to happen. They were not a story the Drenhari would tell proudly, but they were a story the Drenhari would tell. You tell the stories of the things that changed your understanding of the world. You tell them to your young, eventually, when enough time has passed that the telling is instruction rather than wound. Somewhere between the stars, on a carrier that smelled like recycled air and engine oil, and a decade of hard use, in a corridor outside a small room that had no official purpose, a man had stood guard all night over someone who did not need guarding, for reasons that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with something neither of them had named yet. The war was over. No final shot had been fired. No great battle had decided it. It had ended the way really decisive things sometimes end, quietly, in a conversation, when one mind met another mind across the dark and neither of them flinched. Somewhere on that carrier, Sora Vale closed a document and looked at the wall of a room that smelled like old circuitry. She was already thinking about the next problem. There was always a next problem. She was, in a fundamental way, not built for peace. Not because she did not want it, but because peace was where problems hid before they became crises, and someone had to be looking. She picked up a cold cup of tea, she drank it, she went back to work. The galaxy outside was quiet. She did not assume it would stay that way. She was already, in the deep and private architecture of her mind, preparing for the version of tomorrow that nobody else had seen coming yet. As usual, she would be ready before it arrived.